As some of you might be aware, this past week, Thursday evening, I returned home from sunny Phoenix, where I had the joy of gathering with about 40 of my UCC ministry colleagues from across the country, from Maine to Hawaii. We gathered in Phoenix as part of the UCC's Next Generation Leadership Initiative. The program is a 6-year leadership development initiative that equips, energizes, and empowers younger United Church of Christ local church pastors to build vibrant congregations and change lives and further God's mission in the world. This is my 3rd year as part of this group, and each fall gathering in Phoenix consists of a week-long intensive course, each of these different cohorts exploring various aspects of leadership in these changing, uncertain times, exploring what qualities, what characteristics, what skills does leading here and now call forth. I just want to say a word of gratitude, of thank you for this time away, for the deep conversations that I got to have with my colleagues, for Reverend Joe Gastiger stepping in to fill in for me and leading you all in worship, so that I could be away with these colleagues who have become friends and explore conversations about this strange and wondrous call that is pastoral ministry. For the stories that I got to share with them, the laughter and the tears. For the inspiration of their ministries, their creativity, their generosity, the ways they are having profound courage in their own contexts. I'm grateful for this gift of time away with them. It's what my soul needed in many ways. And it's perhaps fitting that on this Sunday before Thanksgiving, I'm finding myself filled with gratitude. The lining that lines up, it works well in that way, gathering with them every year at this time. And it's had me reflecting on this, I don't know, what do we call it? A feeling, a practice, this thing, gratitude that we are invited to choose, even when we don't feel it. And I also, this past week, have been holding that. As I've held that, I've been acknowledging that I'm doing so, even as I find myself in a season where gratitude is not the first thing. It's not been the first thing on my heart or lips. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. After graduating from UW-Madison, I spent 3 years working at a campus ministry before I decided to go off to divinity school. And I remember during that time being a bit in awe and a bit jealous of the campus minister there. Her name was Carla. And how often she was expressing gratitude for people, for things, how often she was naming things in me. She was so good at noticing, at seeing and naming what so many of us, myself included, tended to overlook or keep to ourselves. We might think it, but we never actually verbalize it. Simple things, little things that she appreciated. And I remember one specific moment of envy, of sitting there and thinking, I want that. How do I become that kind of a person? Why is this so hard for me? Why is practicing gratitude so difficult? Suffice it to say that in our world and many of our families and our society, we so often live in the realm of scarcity, right? We see ourselves in competition with one another for attention, for love, for money, for a promotion, for being liked or belonging. There's a scarce amount of resources, and we are in competition with others to get enough of it for ourselves. We so often live, therefore, from fear, the fear of being vulnerable. We think, or we're afraid of what others will think of us, right? Afraid of rejection, afraid of not measuring up, afraid of standing out and being made fun of, and so we don't risk that vulnerability. In my early 20s, I began to realize that I struggled with gratitude not out of some moral failure, although it felt a little bit like that at first, but because fear and scarcity had been core motivators in so many aspects of my life up to that point. I began to wonder, how do I become more grateful? How do I embody more of what I admire in Carla and in others? Like, how do we get there from here to there? It turns out that a key ingredient is to get out of your head and to just start doing the thing. That's a good lesson in life, a simple thing that is a big thing. To just start practicing gratitude even when you don't necessarily feel grateful, because part of what you are doing is training your heart and your mind to notice the gift of life that is all around you. Right? To be human is to receive far more than one could ever give from God, from creation, from others, from society. And so to practice gratitude is to start to notice this big universal truth, this thing that we know to be true, to begin to practice it in the small moments of our everyday lives. And as I've begun to name throughout this service, here's an invitation that my course leader this past week in Phoenix invited us to reflect on throughout that week together, and I want to extend it to you. Notice the small things that are also the big things. To notice something about someone and say thank you, it's a small thing, right? For some of us, it's a really small thing. It's easy. It comes more naturally, perhaps, than to others. But it's also a profoundly big thing, right? Think of a moment when someone made a simple, kind gesture or comment to you. And without even realizing it, they said exactly what your heart needed to hear. It was a small thing. That was also a very big thing. One summer when I was a teenager, my dad, who was a veterinarian, asked me to build a fence around the side of the vet clinic that he owns in the small town where I grew up. And I remember feeling a bit incredulous, like, me? Why are you having me build a fence? Right? Like, my brother is the one who builds things. Why aren't you asking him? Right? I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, I get like the general idea, but like, you probably want a fence that looks more like this than this. And let's just say there's probably a higher chance that it's going to look more like this if you ask me to do it. I just didn't understand. Why are you asking me to do this? Right? I didn't trust myself to be able to execute it with the precision that I felt like a business in town deserved. And I couldn't understand why my dad would trust me either. I mean, maybe he was just looking to save some money or to keep one of his 7 kids out of trouble. In some ways, in many ways, it was a small thing for him to ask me to do this. He could have just as easily hired someone. But I also knew at the time that it really was a big thing for me. It was a small thing that was a big thing because he was trusting me. Right? He didn't stand there and then micromanage and critique me and point out everything that I was doing wrong, which, again, also I wouldn't necessarily blame him for. He's got a small business right in the center of town, right? You want it to look good. But he'd come out in between clients and check in, and I would somewhat frantically ask for advice. I could not, the entire time that I was doing it, I could not believe it. Why is he trusting me to not screw this up? He trusts me? Trust. Inviting someone to do something they don't believe that they can do. Supporting them through it. Helping them learn to believe in themselves. It's a small thing. It is a profoundly big thing. When I graduated college, I was offered a 1-year internship at a UCC campus ministry that would end up lasting for 3 years. And one of the reasons that I continued to stay was because the executive director, whom I only met through this internship, I didn't really know him beforehand, had cut his $40,000 a year salary by 25% so that I would have a modest stipend. And I didn't know this at the time, but when I found out later, I was again incredulous. Right? This is not the way of our world. Who does this? Right? Directors, executives, leaders at the end of or pinnacle of their careers, they don't cut their salaries to make room for interns. But if this one hadn't, I don't know that I'd be standing here today as a minister of the gospel. This one act changed the course of my life. Living on $10,000 a year wasn't much, needless to say, but I stayed for 3 years because when you experience that kind of extravagant generosity, when you work in a culture where this is the norm, it changes you. It's contagious. It makes you want to go and do likewise. A seemingly small thing that was a big, big thing for me. And that's what my week in Phoenix, in part, was full of and made me realize this week. Small things that are actually big things. Gratitude upon gratitude upon gratitude. This might sound a little bit strange, but I think practicing gratitude is especially important right now in the midst of all that we are navigating and enduring in these uncertain times. As a collective, whatever difficulties you are navigating in your own individual lives, I think Dr. Diana Butler Bass, who wrote this book again earlier that I referenced, Grateful, I brought a little show and tell, Grateful. She wrote it in the aftermath of the 2016 election, during a time when, as she says, she was feeling particularly ungrateful. And I think she puts it well. In that context of writing, during a season when one is not particularly grateful or hopeful or feeling good, here's an excerpt as she explored gratitude. Again, part of this is from the quote in our bulletins earlier. Gratitude, she says, is resilience of sorts. It's the defiance of kindness in the face of anger, of connection in the face of division, of hope in the face of fear. Gratitude is something that empowers us. It makes joy and love possible. It rearranges the way that we see and experience what is all around us. Gratitude makes all things new. It transforms how we understand what is broken, and it gives us the ability to act more joyfully and with hope. That's why gratitude, she says, is central to all the world's religions. As a practice, it embodies the wisdom of humanity's greatest spiritual teachers, the love of neighbor. Gratitude takes us from abstract belief to living compassion in the world. And it's the strongest, clearest, most robust, and radical when things are really hard. Really hard. Like all is lost hard. Because she says gratefulness isn't easy and isn't all hearts and flowers. It can be tough in tough times. But a dogged commitment to the giftedness of life can deepen our spiritual capacity to make it through circumstances that threaten to overwhelm us. Reflecting on her own words later, during the pandemic, she added, being grateful didn't end the pandemic. Right? This isn't something that just sort of magically makes the world right, gets rid of all the hard stuff. It didn't It didn't end the pandemic, she says. It wasn't an escape hatch, but it lowered my fear and has enabled me to get through it, especially on those worst days. For many of us, the harshness of life has trained us to look for threats everywhere, to live in scarcity, to look for someone to blame, and to settle in there, to make a habit of living there. And it's understandable. A lot of us have gone through some stuff. We've been trained not to trust. At best, we have often been trained to act differently out of obligation or duty. We have a responsibility, so we're going to do the right thing even though we don't want to do the right thing. But that can work for a time, perhaps, but it's not transformative, and it will burn out if that is where we are living from. And it's certainly not what Jesus calls us to, what Paul names in his letter to the church in Corinth when he calls them to give not with hesitation, not out of obligation or feeling pressured. God loves, God desires us to give from a place of joy. But joy is not possible apart from gratitude, because joy is the recognition of goodness. It's the recognition of connection, of abundance that we did not create ourselves, but we know ourselves to be a part of, to be recipients of. And gratitude doesn't merely say thank you for something and then hoard it for oneself. Gratitude recognizes that one is and desires to be evermore part of the sacred flow of life, always giving and receiving, and giving and receiving. And to stop that flow, to impede that flow, would be to oppose the movement of God. And I think this is what Deuteronomy is speaking to in our reading this morning. Watch yourself, it warns. When things are going well and you tend to think, wow, I'm amazing. Look at all that I have accomplished. I don't need others. This world should kind of be grateful for me. Right? We might not say that part out loud, but that's the quiet part that we sort of feel on the inside. And when you get to that place, it's a sign that you have forgotten that you are the recipient of God's grace, that you are the recipient of the love of others, the support of others, the gifts of others. Keeping God's commands is a reference to how we are called to be in relationship with one another, to be in community. And when you are arrogant enough to think that you are pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, kind of self-made, God says, remember who rescued you from Egypt. Remember who led you through that vast and terrifying wilderness desert. Remember how in the most difficult seasons of life you received grace upon grace from others, people who tended you, people who listened to you, people who helped awaken life within you. Gifts that you did not yourself create. The call to remember the Lord your God is a call from arrogance and hubris, from pride and greed in the actions, the world that they produce. It's a call from that scarcity, that fear place that is so fixated, as understandable as it might be, as fixated on just that pain and the grief, that tunnel vision. It's to shift from there to a life that flows from gratitude. Not denying that other stuff still exists, or pretending it's not as bad as it is, but simply inviting it in alongside it all, to hold that fullness and not become myopic and forget that life is only the bad, hard stuff. Giving thanks, recognizing all the small ways that you receive from God and from creation and from others, have received from this church community, right? A million small things that turn out to be very big things. Perhaps the only things that matter. Whenever I lead a funeral and people begin to share stories of their beloved, I remind us that a human life is not really made up of big moments, the ones that we tend to mark, the big transitions, right? These are not what we recall at the end of life when we're looking back on it all and bringing to mind what mattered, what we hold close to us. We are the products of a million small, everyday, easy-to-overlook moments. And those are the ones I will tell you, having been to a number of funerals, perhaps you can recall yourselves. Those are the moments that we remember and that we share. So let us notice them. Remember them. Let us give thanks. Like, actually give thanks. Don't just keep it to yourself. Tell someone something that you appreciate about them. Something they said or did that really made a difference, even though they probably have no idea. Take a moment to name that and see what happens. Be specific. And then do it again. Start where and with whom it's easy, and slowly take that risk. Gather the courage to do it where it's harder, in circumstances that are tougher. And as you do, you might just realize that it is the small things that are the big things. And it might just begin to transform you. It might just begin to transform our broken, violent, greed-driven world. It might. May it be so. Amen.